Hey, action figure toy fans, welcome back to the Spectra Creative channel. Today, we're going to be continuing our talk on toy trends by talking about re-releases and how they're not always as easy to do as you might think. And I'm not talking about movie re-releases like these, or even reimagining or coming out with a new version of something like this that they do with entertainment all the time. What I'm talking about is in the toy industry when you take an existing product and put it out again, sometimes with absolutely no changes, just doing what's called a second run. And why, especially with the adult collecting segment of the population, the consumers, this isn't as easy as one would think. And I want to address why it's, sometimes difficult when people online are saying, can you re-release this figure? Can you re-release this item? Especially for the adult collector market. So let's talk about that a little bit. For starters, the Masters Universe Classics line, which I brand manage at Mattel. Oh, by the way, I'm ToyGuru Neitlich. I don't think I introduced myself in this video yet. So when I was brand manager of this at Mattel, one of the ways we re-released the figures was changing the packaging by putting a burst that said the original on it, which was actually a nod to the vintage line that had this. So you could tell the difference between the packaging versus the original release versus the second release, as the second release would have the original on it. So yes, we definitely found a way to do a second run. Mattel is doing something very similar to this right now with the Masters of the Universe Origins line, where the first run of the figures have a burst saying new for 2020 at the top. And then the second run and runs down the line will not have this, new for 20 burst that's at the top left-hand corner. Now, when you're dealing with something like a movie re-release, you're not dealing with a huge financial, upfront cost. You can just take the movie and you can put it back in theaters, and it's not like you have to make the movie again. The movie already exists. You're just basically the cost of theaters operating to show the movie. I mean, some movies have been shown steadily for, 30, 40 years, every Friday night at 10 p.m., like Rocky Horror around the country. Doesn't cost any more. They don't have to remake the movie. Rocky Horror already exists. So with a toy, though, when you're re-releasing it, there are way more upfront capital costs. So for starters, you actually have to produce the toy again. And that requires factory time, what's called line time, raw material, and more importantly, inventory management, meaning you don't want to produce something that's not going to sell and is then going to take up space in your warehouse, because this is actually incredibly costly to toy companies when they have product that's not selling. And this is how risk is mitigated, especially when you're dealing with second runs of product, and especially when you're dealing with the collector segment. So the key to this is it's basically like a Venn diagram. You've got your customers who have already purchased, you've got your customers who want to purchase, and you've got your customers asking for the product online. And seeing where all of those factors meet is kind of that sweet spot. But the fact that a large portion of your potential customer base may already have this item, it does shrink the overall population of the new customers. So let's look at an example here with the PKE meter, which was an item that we did re-release on Matty Collector. We did a second run of it. So it sold out, and you had a lot of fans with the PKE meter in hand. See, get it? Because he's holding the PKE meter. Oh, never mind. My images aren't as punny as I think. So you've got, fans who have it. You've got, cosplayers who use it. And then you have people online saying, oh my gosh, I missed it. Can you please re-release the PKE meter? I really, really want it. And, as a brand manager and as a collector, myself, and that's one of the things I think that made me a unique brand manager, was that I'm also a collector. It's like the hair club for men, also a member. I would hear these fans saying online how much they want the PKE meter re-released. But the thing with social media is that it tends to magnify voices way louder than they really are, I guess, if you will, in the real world, meaning it makes people louder than numerous. If you look at things like fan forums where fans post, I once had the Mattel Analytics group review a few websites that were, like fan collector websites. And one site in particular that had thousands of posts every month. Well, it turned out when they actually did the analytics, there were less than 30 unique individuals posting. It was basically the same 30 people, more or less, posting over and over and over again, which is exactly what I mean by louder than numerous. There weren't that many people, but the fan forum made it sound like there were. Now, you're probably saying, well, wait a minute. I see mainstream toys re-released all the time, sometimes, with improved deco, but more or less the same figure. And a perfect example is the vintage collection that Hasbro puts out for Star Wars. They just came out with a new set where you can get Wicket all over again. So Wicket the Ewok on the vintage card was originally released, I think like 10 years ago. And now, Wicket's back, better than ever. But, he's got a new paint job, and, but it's released on the same card. There's a few, differences. I think like the age grade is on the top left corner in a circle now, so you could tell the difference with the card. But the point is 10 years have passed. And are you saying, is 10 years enough for, adult collector product to get reissued? And the answer is no, I'm not talking about adult collectors. I'm talking about kids. Anything sold at retail is primarily bought by kids or moms, parents, gift givers. So the kids who bought Wicket 10 years ago have now grown up and become adult collectors, if you will, if they're still buying toys. Because, time has passed. And now we have a whole new generation that was born 10 years ago, and these babies that were born when Wicket first came out in the vintage collection have now grown up into kids playing with toys. So putting Wicket out again 10 years later is not a collector strategy. It's a kid strategy. You're getting new customers because babies are growing up into children. So you're constantly getting new children into the toy consumer market. But the adult collector is kind of frozen in time, if you will. I mean, once we become an adult, and once we're an adult collector, we're sort of always an adult collector. We don't, while we may gain more adult collectors over time, it's not as many as kids, because all kids play with toys. I mean, more or less. But a smaller segment of the adult population are adult collectors. A lot of adults don't collect toys. But it's hard-pressed to find a child who doesn't play with toys at all. And I'm sure people will give me examples. Now, of course, one way you can try to re-release a figure for adult collectors is by changing it. Like, for example, doing a completely different deco or different head sculpts, different packaging, but actually make a meaningful change to the figure, like Hasbro is doing with the Marvel Legends Kingpin figure, doing him in his animated series colors, or maybe more classic comic book colors, however you want to put it. The point is, it's a meaningful difference versus just straight up re-releasing something, like we did with the PK meter. And this all comes down to what's called MOQ, minimum order quantity. So factories in China, Vietnam, Taiwan have what's called an MOQ, which is usually between 5,000 and 10,000 units. They are not going to produce something unless it's at that quota, or if it's under that quota, they're going to charge the toy companies a huge premium, which is then passed on to the customers with a higher price point. And that's why, certain toys cost so much money, because the quota is so low. So if you're not hitting this MOQ, or if you will, if you're producing to this MOQ, and some of your customers already have the item, you're then depending on customers, adult collectors who haven't bought it, to now be enough to justify that MOQ. And while you might have had enough sales the first time around, the reality check is that there's often not enough customers to hit that MOQ the second time. Because as I said, when we did that study of the fan forums and found how few individual posters there were, this was kind of the proof in the pudding of the fact that the adult collectors tend to be louder than they are numerous. So when you remove the segment of the population that already made a purchase and are left with the remainder to buy a re-release, it's often not enough to not justify the re-release, but actually hit that MOQ for the factory to be able to maintain the price point. Otherwise, you're going to be charged a lot more, and suddenly the re-release has a much higher cost than the original release. And at the end of the day, unsold product is just going to sit in a warehouse and gather dust, and this is kind of what happened with the PK meter. It took years to sell off the second re-release. So it's a perfect example of fans asking for something to be re-released, but it just didn't meet sales expectations the second time around. If you have any other questions about re-releases, let me know. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, let me know in the comments below if I missed anything, and I'll see you guys around the internet for another video about toy trends.